All right, welcome everybody. The second session of The Art of the Sugya, exploration of the literary genius of the Talmud. This class is intended for a style of learning that respects the education of everyone bringing their knowledge and their wisdom and their insight to the Talmud, and to try to give a road in to the experience and the beauty of Talmudic learning, which really is the crown of the Jewish textual culture. Last week we saw a case study. Well, it was discussion of the topic of whether mitzvot need kavanah, if they need intention, or if they don't. And we saw actually it was a way of thinking about standards of what the ideal looks like versus how the real world often operates. And you could think about in terms of we set this ideal standard of the way that religious life and religious services are supposed to look. But on the other hand, we see that the rabbis recognize and acknowledge the way that the real world doesn't always map to what we want it to be. And we see that there being room that the rabbis are making for a more realistic or a more, let's say, even compassionate relationship to what ritual and to what religious practice can look like. And this week we're going to be looking actually at another way in which the Talmud is framing or presenting competing claims. I think the literary nature of the Talmud is the most perfect representation of exactly what it's trying to explore. That is to say, there's no author of the Talmud. Right? No one wrote the Talmud. You can say, sure, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi collated or edited the Mishnah, but he's not the author of it because the text enshrines voices upon voices upon voices, perspectives upon perspectives upon perspectives. It is a multivocal text. It's a text in which it's not just the winner of the argument that gets preserved, but even the loser of the argument gets preserved. Sometimes, often, the argument just stands, and the rabbis say teku, which really just means, we're just going to leave it. We're going to leave it for, it says, Tishbi Yavo, until Eliyahu Hanavi comes at the end of time and solves all of our arguments for us. But what does it mean to be living in the real world? It means that not everything's clear, right? That there's not one right answer, but there's actually multiple perspectives that are worth paying attention to. So in today's topic, we're going to be looking at the question of what kinds of claims can you make on somebody else, and how do you adjudicate those claims? So we see rabbis bumping up against rabbis in terms of their opinions, and we're going to look at the laws of being a neighbor. The laws of being a neighbor and how you are either allowed or not allowed to shelter yourself off, to shelter in place, as it were, or to construct divisions between you. And can you even impinge on your neighbor to coerce them into being party to those divisions? So we're going to see how claims of damage can actually be fueling the claims that you make on somebody else. How much someone is responsible for you and how much you're responsible to them. What are the limits of what we can ask? Not even ask, but actually command of somebody else. What does it mean to live in society? What does it mean to live in a society in which you are next to other people? Right? In Judaism, we don't have this fantasy of just going off into the desert and being by yourself. You're always amidst other people. But what does it mean to be amidst other people? What kind of claims do they make on you? What kind of claims can you make on them? And that's what we're going to be looking at. And again, it's really perfectly enshrined in this text in which there are opinions and ideas and perspectives, all of them jostling against each other. Right? It's not controlled by one singular perspective, but the Talmud is a text that recognizes the multivocal nature of reality. That there's many people around, and everyone has their own opinion. I think, as we know quite well. So we're going to look at a very interesting text. It is the first sugya. It's the first discussion in the Masechet of Bava Batra. Now, Bava Batra is effectively the tractate of the Talmud that is most concerned with property rights. So there's three bavas. Bava is the Aramaic word for gate. And the theory actually of a lot of historians is that originally it was one big mega tractate called Nezikin, called damages. But it got broken up into three to make it more manageable. So the first one's called Bava Kama, the first gate. The second one's called Bava Metzia, the middle gate. And the last one's called Bava Batra, the last gate. You probably could have predicted that. So the this is the first real discussion in Bava Batra in which what we're talking about is when people are going into property together, when they are joint owners of property. What does it mean to shake out or to discern what each of our responsibilities are? Right? I think many, it's perhaps the case that many of us have experienced something like this, in which we are joint participants in something. Well, let's say you're part of a team at work, right? Or let's say you were doing an assignment together in school, and it's not clear. Or let's say you're raising children together, right? It's not clear how the responsibilities shake out. It's only determined when you make a decision about it, right? When you come to some kind of agreement. So here, what we have are two people, at least, who own property together, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. If they're going to be kind of like they're in their 20s and just like sharing an apartment in kind of a haphazard way, or are they going to be saying, okay, we bought it together because of financial reasons, but really in a sense like we're going to try to split it up because it's really just de facto that we own it together. But before we get to that, I just want to make sure we all have the background right. But I want to begin with some questions, and the questions have to do with the major topic. So this class is called "My Eyes Hurt," but usually we'll say that when like you have an eye ache or something like that, or your eyes are irritated. But here it's "My eyes hurt," like in the transitive sense, like you can hurt someone with your eyes. Namely, can you cause damage through sight? Can you, through your prying eyes, in some way hurt somebody else? Is that damage? And we'll explain why I'm putting the quotes around that in a minute. But first, I want to start with some orienting questions. So, first question I have is, do you think people have a right to privacy? Do people have a right to privacy? And what does it mean to say that?
Yes.
What does it mean to say that as a right?
You mean a legal right?
Yes.
I would think, yeah, legally, I don't know. Well, somebody can't come barging in through my door. So, I mean, I have a right to
Okay.
be alone in my apartment.
Okay.
So that's some right to privacy. Peeping Tom, that's illegal. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's also a right to privacy.
Okay.
Um,
Let's
but but
let's
if
be
you're in a
precise.
store, you don't.
So let's be precise. So you're saying you don't you have your property lines seem to map out in terms of your property rights. So, you own something and somebody
Right.
who doesn't own it can't come in there willy nilly.
Right, or you rent it, but whatever. You
Right.
have
So
some kind of, yeah,
I have a lease, right? I'm renting an
me
apartment.
too.
And on the lease, it actually delineates specifically when the landlord is allowed to come into my apartment. Like he has to give me notice before he does so because I, as a tenant, have certain rights, but they're
Right.
conditional rights. Right? He owns it. I don't own it. But because I'm
Mhm.
leasing it from him, he's ceded some of his rights to me.
That's correct.
Except, let's say, if you're the police, right? The police are allowed to enter your apartment or enter your property as long as they have cause, right? You have a warrant that allows for search and seizure or something like that, right? So even like the seemingly absolute claim about private property still is conditioned in some way because of the way in which we are all pitching in as one society, right? We've ceded some of our rights in some ways because of our cooperative arrangement.
It
Um,
also it
yeah.
also depends a lot on what the original right to the property was. I was just reading on the BBC about Singapore, where in Singapore almost everybody, has only leasehold rights for 99 years, except for a couple of few people who actually have freehold rights, in which they actually own the land. And it showed a huge development which can't go ahead because these people have freehold rights to the land and they don't have leasehold rights to the land. That also applies, in effect, to the land of Israel, where most or almost all property is 99-year-old leasehold, whereas in Canada, almost all property is freehold.
Okay. Right. So here we have, so I think implied in this is this idea that like renting means in some way your rights are contingent, right? You're not on such a secure basis because it's dependent on the real owner. Whereas when it comes to owners, right, there it seems like property is I'm looking for. It maps to what they're, to the extent of their rights. Except that right here, I mean, that exactly sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. What is it? When is it? If it's the case that you jointly own something with somebody, right? It seems like now control is something that is by its very nature now negotiated, because you can't kick out somebody who owns it with you. So how actually, once you're in the same box, right? You're in the same property box. How are you actually able to negotiate what privacy or what personal rights look like? Now, before I want to zoom back to what we were saying before about peeping toms, and that's very relevant. Actually, we're going to see explicitly later in the text. But that is a certain kind of using your eyes to pry, right? Specifically, it's using your eyes to pry in which what you're looking at is specifically something that you have control over or sensitivity about, namely your body, or an act that you're doing. But it's not the case that it's not that peeking into other people's building necessarily, and like looking at through people's windows, if you have like real estate jealousy or something like that. So so even that is in some ways like it's still negotiated. Yeah, Rachel.
Thank you for remembering my name.
Quite welcome.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, I don't know if we're focusing on property specifically today, but I know like there's a halacha about, in terms of privacy, not looking at someone's mail.
Yes, that's Takanos Rabbeinu Gershom, and that was instituted in the 10th century. But that, yeah, I mean, like in contemporary society, it is a felony to, for instance, take mail out of a congressperson's office. Just a random example. You can't look at other people's mail here either, right? It's technically, it's actually a felony. So here we have, right, the idea in which like your personal business then
I think that the mail being...
One second, Eric. Your personal, like what Rachel is saying, your personal business actually now in a sense becomes an extension of you, right? The mail that you receive now in some way is imbued with your personal rights. Like, okay, you get a letter, sure. Like, what's to say that that is something that has, like, that's such a big deal? But because it's potentially something that's sensitive, like Rachel is quite right to point out, like in some way, it's an extension of ourselves. Yeah.
I think that mail, not opening somebody else's mail, and that the post office cannot look at your mail, goes back to ancient Persia. It goes right back to the that far, and I think that almost all of the laws, ours and the stuff on the halachot that are in that were issued, are all based on that very early principle that the mail is sacrosanct, and that the mailman is the agent, and he can't read your mail, and you can't read somebody else's.
I think we have to be a little careful in terms of making those kinds of historical claims, because Takanos Rabbeinu Gershom is from the 10th century, and it applied specifically to the European context, in which actually the Sephardic world never adopted that takana.
Also,
but I think they had a principle behind it everywhere about not reading not reading mails of others.
Okay, yeah. Someone wanted to say something, and then I want to start focusing on the text. But yeah.
To add, I think Josh, you were just saying, I just realized I think it's expired in the Ashkenazi context as well.
It's a takana, so it's 1,000 years old. So once the 1,000 years pass, it's over. But it's still kind of limp. It's still limping along. People don't like treat it like it's expired. But yeah.
But okay, I think
don't go off and be polygamous all of a sudden.
I think like what you were saying at the beginning, how like the last class was sort of talking about there's the ideal and then the sort of lived reality that we live in community. And I think like, yeah, we've put a lot of privacy laws. Privacy has become a big conversation, especially since the internet and stuff. But I think that there's a lot of things that you can't, I think it's a bit unreasonable to expect 100% privacy all the time. So like,
right.
People are, like you said, people are walking down the street. I have my windows open and my lights on right now. Like they can see in my house. Like, and I suppose that's my own choice, but like I could close the blinds. Or like my mailman delivered the wrong letter to my house. I had to like, okay, this is for my neighbor. And I had to walk it over to my neighbor's house. Like I don't know, like, or when you sign like clipboards of like everyone else's information is on it, at whatever you're signing, like there's,
right.
You get exposed to other people's information on a really regular basis.
Right. So very good. So I think that really sets us up quite nicely, Susie, in terms of like it's there's some like kind of enlightenment theories in which trying to think about society, they start like, okay, first we're all individuals. And then we, at some mythical point in the past, made a social contract and we agreed to become a community. We agreed to become a society. And now we're stuck. Right? You can't really go back. But is that true? Right? Like that's like a myth, and it works philosophically because it wants to derive this this notion of society from first principles. But the fact is, we're always, you're born you're born screaming into a world full of people. Right? It's never the case that you're like by yourself alone. You're always in some way negotiating what it means to be an individual in a world of other people. Right? It's exactly what, in a sense, it means to try to figure out what it means to become yourself. Is you have to figure out like, how am I distinct from others? What is like, what's me and what's not? Right? These are really interesting psychoanalytic questions. But think about it from a legal perspective. Right? The question in some way is, what kinds of claims can we make on other people? What do others owe us, and what do we owe others? Now, when I put the word damage in quotations before, it was because we're referring to damage as a technical category. Damage is something you can claim, a tort, right, as they call it in the law. Right? Is visual damage a tort? Can you say, you hurt me with your eyes, you've pried into my personal business, and because of that, you actually owe me something? Or you are responsible to make sure that that's not going to happen in the future. That's what we're going to try to figure out, but we have to get there first, right? That's the refrain we're going to keep on seeing in this class, is that these ideas don't just kind of happen upon us, but rather they're something that's achieved through discussion, achieved through debate. That's how we get to this principle, to the principle that we'll get to, and we'll see how the rabbis in the Gemara squeeze it in there. But it might not be obvious. So let's start with the Mishnah. Right, this is the first Mishnah of Bava Batra, and it has to do again with joint property rights. So it says shutafin, right, partners who want a mechitza, and I'm leaving that untranslated for a reason. We'll see that later. Who want a mechitza in a courtyard, build the wall in the middle. Okay, so just simple, tachlis. What's the situation we're talking about? Who are these partners? Why are they called partners? What are they doing? They're not cowboys. They're not partners. They're partners. What does that mean?
I get the feeling of co-tenants as opposed to actual owners.
Okay, interesting. And what gives you that sense?
Well, I guess the word courtyard, it's like we all live in the same building, and so.
Right, good. Okay, so this is actually the way in which lives in the ancient land of Israel, right, in Roman Palestine, this is how they were constructed, right? They were basically all these like row houses, right, these joint houses in which they were around a central plaza. Right, that's the courtyard. But different houses opened onto that plaza together. So the question is, who owns it? So here we have a case in which there's two people who own their respective homes, and there's a courtyard in the middle, and they jointly own the courtyard. Right, but you're quite right in the sense of like their rights to it are contingent on each other, though, not on some kind of like majestic landlord, but on each other because they own it together. And they want to build a mechitza in the middle. Now, what's interesting is that they want to, and that's going to be very relevant soon. And they want to build a mechitza. Now, we know what it is from like a synagogue, but how would you translate the word mechitza? Because the fact I'm leaving it untranslated means it's going to stick in the rabbi's craw. But how would you translate the word mechitza?
Fence in this case.
Okay, so you see it as a fence. Why?
Yeah. Because it's a division.
Okay.
And
So it's a division.
it's a division.
Okay.
So probably the easiest way to do a division is a type of fence. I mean, there's different kinds of fence, but some type of fence or a fence with a gate.
Okay,
But
so because the word
a
mechitza
division.
means division, you see
Yeah.
it as implying the most basic version of a division,
A
namely
physical division.
a fence
Yeah.
of some kind. Great. Okay. Who else has a different? Who else reads mechitza differently? Or or do people agree? I mean, it's implied it's a fence.
Because it's outside, because it's a
Uh-huh.
courtyard,
Uh-huh.
more likely to be a fence or wall.
Okay, a fence or a wall. So you see it as kind of being agnostic. It could be whatever, but something physical.
I see it as the concept of dividing something in half, and whether you can actually ever divide something exactly in half.
Sure. I mean, you get like an assayer in there, and he measures it out, and he's like, okay, here's half of the courtyard. This one's yours. The other half, that one's yours. Great, done. But what's the mechitza?
Oh, like what's it made out of?
What is it?
I have no idea what mahitza means, but it feels like you're driving really hard at the possibility that it's something conceptual and not physical.
Why do you think that?
Just because of the way that you've responded to all the answers.
No. I'm just listen, if there's anything you take from this class is that nothing is assumed. Everything can be questioned. Everything can be questioned. Okay, so no, what's really funny though is one second, Max. Is that what's very funny is that like literally what everyone has said so far is almost verbatim what we're gonna see in the Gemara. And I hope that feels good because you're on the rabbi's wavelength. You're feeling it. Good. Yeah, Max.
I mean, I'm just thinking about like sharing a dorm room. So there might not be like a physical separation, but there's kind of an agreement. Okay, we can see that like this half is mine.
Okay.
We can like visually estimate, and like I'm not gonna have like my stuff like making a mess in
What's
your
the
side.
consequence of that though? Let's say it's just like an agreement. Pizza is just like the concept of a division. But then what's the consequence?
There's nothing, I guess there's no objective proof if, someone has impinged on someone else's space, I guess.
Right.
It's hard to,
It's
there's
not-
nothing to point to.
Like it's not enforceable.
Okay,
Yeah.
You're like, listen, you like violated this kind of fuzzy concept that we agreed to. I mean, the argument is it would be good fences make good neighbors, right? You want a good fence, or like it's the movie, right? In the movie or the dorm room, and like the two dorm mates fight, and then you have to divide it with a big thing of Scotch tape, right? And everything has like a piece of tape going through it. So pushback to the fact that it is a concept is the fact that the word bonin shows up right here. The word bonin means they build it, right? So it seems like something's getting built. And pushback to the fence idea is that the word wall shows up right afterwards. So it seems like it's a wall, not just a mere fence. And yet, you will see how that, even like the fact that we have the explicit word wall and the verb to build right there in the text, right? Build and wall. And yet, the rabbis agree with you, you cannot be so like credulous. You have to overthink everything if you're going to really understand. Okay.
Could be a hedge.
It could well be a hedge. It could well be a hedge. Now, I cut out the part of the text in which it says like what you're supposed to build it out of, because it ends up, I think, being misleading because the rabbi's going to take it somewhere else. But it could well be a hedge. Okay, so it says
He just used the word hedge, which has two meanings in English.
as a noun?
As in hedging your bet,
Sure.
as being, and as a physical thing of plants. And I think both of them apply.
Could be. I was thinking of it more in like the animated, like the cartoon sense, in which it's got like it's a thing of bushes in which there's like a playful raccoon that ends up causing mischief. But yeah, no, it's so some kind of division in which like it's clearly demarcated where one side is and where the other side is. But also another thing to pay attention to, right, is how did this thing get built? What had to happen first for them to agree to make this division? It seems like they had to agree to it, right? Hashutafin shiratzu. Partners who want to make a mechitza in the courtyard, they make it. Now, again, how does it happen? How does it get built? Well, funds have to go towards it. Is it the case that because they're partners, they need to the only way it can get built in which you can make a claim on somebody else, like a lien on somebody else, in which you force them to contribute to the project, is the only way that that's the case is if you agree to it or not. And we're going to look into that. In other words, is this something that, in a sense, can only be committed to if you've committed yourselves intentionally? Or is it something that, in a sense, someone can just activate their right to a division, and then you can corral the other person into it? So we'll be exploring that soon. So it says further, and similarly, v'chein, begina, in a garden, where it is common to put up a fence. Ligdor. So here, actually, they have the term ligdor. So now we've moved from wall to fence. Maybe the word is slipping. Maybe it isn't so clear what they're supposed to be putting up. The court can obligate to do so. Now, if you paying attention to the translation, I inserted the phrase "the court." In the Hebrew, it just says mechayavin oto. They compel one, but the they refers to the court, right? The people with the power to coerce you into doing something. It's not, it's the people in society who we grant that power to. The judges, the justice system, right? They can coerce you into doing it. So in a garden where it is common to put up a fence, the court can obligate you to do so. Now, what does that mean? Like, what's implied there?
If one neighbor refuses to contribute to the cost of the fence, wall, whatever, the mechitza, then the court can obligate that person, can force them to pay their half.
Very good. Okay, that's definitely a strong possibility here. But what's it conditioned on?
Oh, that it's common. That this is it's a common thing.
Exactly.
It's generally understood in society that in such a case you would put up a separation, division of some kind.
Good. Now,
it's also conditioned on the fact that that court has the power of enforcement.
Yes, courts have the power of enforcement.
No, but what court is it in this discussion? Is it a Roman court, a Jewish court delegated by the Romans? I just am confused over who's the court and who has the power.
Good question. So there is a dual legal system that we're dealing with here. There is a Jewish legal system and there's a Roman legal system. The two, never the twain shall meet. It is the case that the Jewish legal system has certain derogated authority and rights vis-a-vis the population it is organized in, right? The Jewish population. Those don't extend to capital punishment, right? The Jewish court cannot put anyone to death. But the Jewish court does have certain coercive powers, and they definitely extend up to property rights. So here, when the Jewish text is talking about courts, it's talking about the Beis Din. It's talking about a Jewish court. And the Jewish court can obligate you. Beis Dins are still in operation today, and they do still have certain extent of power. But usually it's because we live in a world in which, like, religion is a private affair. The state doesn't back it up. Here the emperor, right, has it's given certain rights to Jews, but we are talking about at least a semi-independent legal system. But the court does have the power, it seems, to put a lien on your property, right, and to force you to pony up to pay for the offense in a place where it is customary to do so. But in a place where it's not customary to do so, if, for instance, you are a joint owner of an open field, you can't be corralled into it. You can't be marshaled into it. Yeah. Is someone going to say something? Okay. Great. So, and when we say an open field, we mean a fence running through the middle of it, right? And the purpose of it is, again, to divide between people. Now, interestingly, we're going to get to it. The Gemara is going to very quickly actually come up with a very interesting reason why you'd need to put up a field. And it's going to give you a very interesting analogy. But for now, we know everything we need to know. Joint ownership of property. It seems like there's an idea that at least in a situation in which it is common and customary to do so, you can be coerced into be contributing to building a division between them. Now, we haven't even gotten into why you might want that division. That's left open. But at least in a situation in which it's common to want one, you have the right to get one. And you even have the right to coerce your partner into pitching in to help out. But not in a situation in which it's not common to do so. Okay, and the question we are left in is, what's the chatzer? The chatzer seems to be like a garden, because it says, and similarly in a garden. And it seems the similarly is referring to the courtyard, right? The courtyard is the paradigmatic case, and the garden is the secondary case. So it seems like also in that case, it might be the case, it seems like it's the case, likely the case, that the court can marshal you into contributing for some kind of division, right? Dividing between the two. Okay, now, if you remember, I have a little trick in which I like to bold certain phrases in the Talmud. The fact that nothing's bolded here means what? Do you remember why I bolded certain phrases? Or certain word pairs? It's test. No, just kidding. It's not really a test. What I bolded was people's names. So is there any bold here in the text?
Nope.
No bold. Great. So we have a classic example of the fact that like the first sugya in many masechtos, in many tractates of the Talmud, is almost entirely just reasoning. It's just like rabbis riffing on stuff. And it's not just that, but there's even a subcategory called the Saboraic sugyas. Saboraic because it's from the word svara. And there was an idea that there was like a group of rabbis after the Amoraim, after the rabbis of the Gemara, who were not, who were just like debating ideas. And they're not named, they're anonymous, they're part of like the anonymous strand of the Gemara. And they're just like very conceptual, very abstract. So this is a good example of a Saboraic sugya, because it just literally starts with the word svarua. They reasoned. They were trying to figure this out. And they start with a linguistic, abstract, conceptual question. And that question is exactly the one that we started with ourselves. What's this mechitza thing? What is a mechitza? When we say mechitza, what do we mean? Again, one of the takeaways I really want from like Gemara cup, as you develop your Gemara cup, right, your Talmud head, your Talmud brain, it's that nothing should be taken for granted. It really makes us rethink everything that we just like kind of rest easy on in some ways. And there's something very strong and powerful about that, because to be able to justify everything, to say, you know what, I have a reason for that. I can tell you why. I can explain myself to you. Talmud is a social form of religion. Not just because it involves multiple perspectives, but because what it asks of us is to be able to explain ourselves to another. And to believe that we are explicable to each other. We're not just, like some random idea and some random personality, but that we can communicate who we are and what we think to each other. We can explain ourselves to you. It's very, it's very subtle, but to me, it's a very powerful spiritual element and a social element to what the Talmud entails. So some reasoning. What's this mechitza? New? It's a partition. Fine. Gouda. Gouda is just like the word for, it's split down the middle. As we see in a Braita, if a partition in a vineyard was breached, the owner of a neighboring grain field can say, put it up. If it is breached again, the neighbor can say, again, put it up. And if the vineyard owner is negligent and does not rebuild it, the intermingling produce is taboo. And the vintner, the vineyard owner, I just wanted to use the word vintner, is responsible for the loss. Okay, what's this situation? Is it the same or is it different? How is it the same and how is it different? What's missing here that was primary in the Mishnah?
Joint ownership.
Yes, précisément, exactly. We are not talking about joint owners anymore. Who are we talking about?
These are neighbors.
Neighbors.
With neighboring, with adjoining vineyards.
Well done. Yes,
Thank
it's
you.
neighbors now. So before we had joint owners, which is like, it's intuitive, fine, yes, you own something together, you have to negotiate what goes on inside of it. That makes a certain amount of sense, like right, like what Max was saying. Two roommates in a dorm room, and you got to figure out, like, unless you want to have that situation which you totally split things out in the middle, you have to negotiate. That's what it means to to live together with somebody. But these aren't joint owners anymore. These are neighbors. And what's implied here, that the Talmud, or this is a Breita, this is a Tannaitic statement. Does it see property rights as being absolute? No, because the neighbor can force you to put up a wall. Or can they? We'll look into it. But if there's a wall there already and it gets busted, then the neighbor can say, put it back up. And if it busts again, the neighbor can keep on reiterating, put it back up, put it back up. That right does not expire. And if you don't do that, if you are negligent, you are on the hook for the monetary loss. Now, what is the monetary loss? So we just look
I got a problem with the monetary loss.
Well, one second. Let's make sure we know what the loss is. So the loss is derived from the law of kilayim. Kilayim is the Torah-based law that you're not allowed to sow different species together in the same field. So especially when it comes to vineyards, vineyards need to be kept separate from other planted fields. So here what we have is a vineyard that abuts another field, and the two seeds cannot mix, which means that if they do end up mixing, then the produce is taboo. And I don't just mean taboo like I mean taboo like literally it's become sanctified, right? Like the anthropological notion of taboo. It is something that now you cannot eat anymore. You can't sell it. You can't gain any benefit from it. You need to just let it be. But it's ruined your field because now your field is technically the property of the temple. It's become
I have a problem with whether with the question of the taboo, as you call it, on the question of whether you're forbidden to derive benefit from it, or you're just forbidden to own it.
You're forbidden to derive benefit from it.
Okay.
Like you can't sell it. You've now taken a huge loss. Your whole field.
I just wanted to be clear on the loss because there are, three levels. You can't own it. You can't own it. You can't sell it, and you can't derive any benefit from it. I think I got those.
So selling it is the benefit, and then the last one is you can't consume it.
You can't consume it.
Right. Okay. So owning it's something like chametz, right? You can't own chametz during Pesach. But with this, what you can't do is you can't get hana'ah from it. You can't profit from it. But the point is that you take a loss, right? So if the seeds and the vineyard end up mixing with each other, it means it becomes kilayim, and now you have taken a real loss. And the neighbor now can take you to court and say, pay up because you were negligent. You didn't put up the wall, and because you didn't put up the wall, the wind blew the seeds and it ended up scotching both of our fields. So good job.
Is there an option that it's the owner's fault that there's something wrong with the partition? And why wouldn't the neighbor also be responsible for putting it up if it's separating their property?
Great point. Great point. So where's the partition seem to be located then?
Well, I think your mom's sort of asking the same question I was about to, like, why is the neighbor always saying, hey, you have to put up the wall? Like, why isn't the neighbor just building their own wall?
Right. Because where does the partition seem to be located?
It says it's in the vineyard, but one would assume it's separating the two properties.
That's right. Good. So it seems that the vineyard owner built a wall at some point on his property. But the neighbor has rights to it and can say, because you're the controller of the wall, Mr. Neighbor Vineyard Guy, you have a responsibility to me as your neighbor to make sure that it's maintained. Right? A fence that fences off your backyard is your responsibility. And if you leave the fence open and let's say your dog escapes from the backyard and goes into your neighbor's vegetable garden and ends up destroying all their vegetables, and let's say it's a significant loss, they can take you to small claims court and say, listen, you were negligent. You let your, you left your wall breached, and a destructive force that you own got out of it, and now my garden's ruined. Because the wall is on the the vineyard's property, it seems like it's the vineyard owner's responsibility. But you're quite right. Both you and Susie are quite right to highlight that the neighbor of the field is able to make a claim on the vineyard guy. That's a very interesting reach, and it's not assumed, and it shows that there are rights that there are claims you can make on someone else because of what they owe you. Once the wall is up, at least, that's the thing. Like, can we say that that the field guy can say, put up a wall? We haven't gotten there. We don't know if we can say that necessarily. But once there's a wall, and it is in the control of the vineyard owner now has, it seems, in perpetuity, a responsibility to keep it maintained. Such that you can say, hey, look, you need to fix the wall if it gets busted. Okay, so the Gemara here seems to be trying to draw an analogy of some kind, but remember, the analogy isn't between cases. The analogy, interestingly, is just trying to figure out what the word mechitza means. But mechitza is saying it means a guda. It means just a division. It's a partition. But that hasn't given us that much information. But at least we know it's dividing things, right? The word mechitza comes from the word chetzi, which means half. Right? So it seems like it's a divider. It's halvening things up. But here we're going to get into now we're going to try to start deriving from this, right? If mechitza means means partition, we can infer then that what undergirds the Mishnah is that both parties wanted to put it up, right? As we highlighted before, they were ratzu. They had a ratzon, right? They both agreed. They had a consensus around it. So which means then if they didn't agree to it, you can't compel them. So here we're back to our original case. Joint owners of a courtyard, and now the rabbis are saying, aha, the reason you can compel is because you've come to some kind of agreement. But you can't just out of the blue tell your partner, your courtyard partner, hey, I need you to put up a wall here, or I need you to pony up 50% of a wall or a partition. Okay, so how strong then is the right to a wall if we say it's contingent on agreement? It seems like it's not as strong anymore, right? So now if you're a joint owner of a property, it seems that you don't have the right, at least at this place in the conversation, to compel your partner to separate from you. That once you're in it, you're in it to win it. And the only way you are able to come to a division is through conscious uncoupling, right? In like today's language, you've consciously uncoupled. You've decided to go in, build a wall. You have joint custody of the courtyard. You're very enlightened about it, right? But you've put up a wall in the middle, and that's something you've agreed to. But if you haven't agreed to it, well, tough noogies. You should have thought of that when you originally drew up the contract. You can't just change it on the spot. And here we come to our final derived principle. And thus, if the right to compel your partner into contributing for the wall is agreement, thus, visual damage, or hezek re'iyah, vision-based damage, is not really damage. Why? How do we get there? Real question. Yeah.
I guess if the paragraph before is saying that if you didn't agree to it, you can't compel the other person to either have to pay for it or or anything like that. So then if the other person who didn't want the wall is complaining, but now I can't see the rest of the garden or whatever they're trying to complain about the existence of the wall, it's not, it sort of goes both ways. Well, you didn't have to pay for it, but you also can't complain that it's damaging you somehow. Is that
Right.
right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So it seems like the wall is intended in some way to prevent hezek re'iyah, prevent vision damage. Now, vision damage is like what we were intuiting before, like not quite peeping Tom, but the fact that you can look into someone else's business, right? Actually, quite nicely what Rachel, I think, inferred before about looking at the mail, right? The looking at the mail, the real issue of that isn't, in a sense, property right, infringement, but really it's about the fact that you're impinging on someone's right to have a privacy about their business, right? You can't be like looking into what they're dealing with. So here the question is, do I have a right, like ab initio, right? Like just from the outset, do I have a right to say, I have a right to ensure that you will not look into my stuff? And the answer seems to be no. You don't have a right to separate yourself off. And really, when we say right, what I really mean is you don't have a right to make a claim on someone else to contribute towards it. Now, what can you always do? You can build a wall. Right? Like you can put up, well, I don't know. Actually, here's an interesting question. Let's say you're joint owners of a courtyard. If you put up a wall at the 49% line, right? Like let's say there's 50% of the wall. It's right down the middle. And then clearly on your side of the courtyard, right? Like where your house is, you put up a wall. And you've like ceded 1% of it to your neighbor. Do you think that that is actually in your rights?
No.
Okay.
Toronto bylaw standards would say yes. Toronto bylaw standards would say yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so wait, first Max.
I'm thinking about, kind of a different section of Talmud and Halacha and stuff, and that's of like Eruvin. So in that you have a few different types of space. So there's public space, private space, and then there's a Carmelite.
Right,
and a Carmelite is kind of like a mixed space of like, it's semi-private, but you still can't really like claim any specific part as your own or not. So yeah, there's kind of an intermediate kind of space that is difficult to define.
But what is the courtyard?
Oh,
what kind of property is it?
My memory now. Okay.
No, just think intuitively. Don't worry about the category. Just think intuitively.
It's a shared space.
Okay, good. But it's shared between whom?
Between the
person A and person B, right? Yeah. Let's say person C walks into the courtyard. Is that trespassing?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not public property.
No.
Right, good. It's private property is jointly owned private property, which means that both co-owners have rights to it. Right, but the question is how far.
The assumption is that they both have rights to the whole space unless they agree that.
Okay, good. I want to unpack that. So so you're saying, listen, intuitively, no. If you like went in Dutch on a courtyard with somebody, in a sense, you're like, I bought it. I didn't have the money to do it on my own. I found like a buyer for it. They like it too. And what I was buying was rights to the whole property. It's just that I negotiate those rights with somebody else, right? Like we both have rights to the whole property. But what's the bylaw, Susie, that you were getting at? Toronto bylaw says what?
Well, okay, it's not so
Toronto bylaw says what? Sorry, yeah.
It's not. I don't know how it would apply to like a shared.
All right, let's imagine it's a real bylaw. What does the bylaw say?
So me and my neighbor, if I build something that's on literally my property, like so I am not impinging on their property. I have the right to build that fence. I can't build any structure I want because there's city bylaws governing that. But as long as it's within my property line, I can build a fence and I can build it as high as I want.
I see. Okay.
But if I try to build on the right of way, so there's always a gap in between houses, that's called the shared right of way. That now
that sounds like a courtyard.
Infringing.
Yeah, no, it's more complicated than that, because there's actually a tribunal that handles only those cases between neighbors, and they try to set up a situation where you negotiate. I looked that up. You can look
Wait,
that
that sounds precisely like what we're talking about. So we're talking about right of way. That's the courtyard, right? Which is something that private property is abutting, and it seems like you have shared competing claims on it. So Susie, now interestingly, right? But the example you're giving is that like on your property, you have a right to build something. Sure, that's like the vineyard guy building his wall. But we're talking about a jointly owned thing, right? So the question is, do you have a right to build something in the causeway? And it seems to be no. But so another way of thinking about it might be, and it seems like maybe that's not the bylaw, might be when I go in joint ownership with something, it might be the case that you're thinking actually, intuitively, I actually own 50% of it. Like I have 50% of a stake in it, and thus I have 50% of the property. And in 50% of the property, I can do whatever I want. Now, I'm just saying, I'm just opening it as a possibility. But it seems here, at least from the conclusion of the of this part of the Gemara, that you don't have absolute rights to do something. You cannot compel your co-owner into doing it because you don't have the right to separate off from them. You don't have the right to preclude them from looking at you, as it were. But we're going to see how far that goes, because that's not going to be left standing. That's going to be a bone of contention for the Gemara, and it's the meat that we're going to be sinking our rhetorical teeth into. So let's go further. Weiter, as they say, further. But what if we were to say that the mechitza just means a division? Aha! Back to Lauren, right? Weren't you saying, it means a fence, right?
Yeah, I said
There we
it meant a fence. Well,
okay.
Something physical dividing.
Yes, okay, so that's actually a phrase we'll see in a minute, mesifas be'alma. Like, literally, it just means, it's just a fence. It's just like stakes in the ground, right? But you got almost the exact language. It's amazing. Everything that people are saying, you're so on the rabbi's wavelength. I'm so, your instincts and intuition and insights are great.
I inherited from my dad.
We all inherited from our ancestors the wisdom that is in our kishkis. Baruch Hashem. All right, v'cheivan jaratzu, right? And since they agreed to divide the jointly owned land, they build a wall, even against their will, and thus has a kriya shmei hazek. And because of that, then no, you can say that vision damage is real damage, and you can compel your co-owner into building it. Now, how do we get there? This seems a little bit less fully argued. So let's make sure we get their reasoning. So why are we starting from the fact that it's just like a spare fence? It's not a wall. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. It's the opposite. So plugta here actually means a physical division. Right? Gouda before meant like a partition, right? You're just saying like what Max was saying before. It could be as conceptual as just saying that's the line. No more. But let's say mechitza is plugta. Let's say it's actually a wall. And once they enter into an agreement to build the wall, and that's explicit language we saw in the Mishnah, Baal korcho, even against their will. Now, how do we get there? The plugta is just the division, right? It's just the max conceptual division, right? Say it's maybe as simple as just putting like a strip of tape down the middle. You say 50% mine, 50% yours. So what's the agreement now? Interestingly, what they did was the rabbis put a comma there, but the Gemara isn't punctuated. Whatever punctuation you see, I've put, but that one I left out because I wanted to see what they did. So before, if you go back to the Mishnah, it sure seemed like what they agreed to was to build the wall, right? Bonin et hakatzel, shiratzu la'asod mechitza b'chatzer, bonin et hakatel. Except that the rabbis now are saying, what if mechitza doesn't mean the wall? What if mechitza means just a division? So what they've agreed to do now is to say, listen, we went into partnership together and we're going to consciously uncouple. We're going to say, yes, at one point both of us owned 100%, but now each of us owns how much? 50, right? Each of us are now split. We are now, in a sense, singular owners of half of the thing. And once you agree to make that division, now what can your neighbor do? Because now you're not co-owners anymore, in a sense. Now you're neighbors. And now we can go back to that analogous case with the vineyard. What can you do to your neighbor? What can you compel them to do? Put up a wall. All right, I want to make sure we get the logic down. There can be two meanings of mechitza. One is that it's the object that divides, right? It's a wall. Another one is that it's just the concept of dividing. If it's the wall itself, then what you've agreed to is the wall. And thus, if you didn't agree to it, can you coerce your co-owner into building the wall? No, because you didn't agree. But here, the agreement isn't tied to the object. The agreement is now just tied to dividing the property. Once you and your co-owner decide to split up, like, okay, we're splitting, we're uncoupling. Instead of being a joint owner of 100%, we are now separate owners of 50%. But once you've agreed to divide, now what further right do you have? Now you can compel your neighbor or your former co-owner into putting up a wall. In other words, once you've agreed to divide, now what do you have a right to?
Privacy.
Privacy. Punkt. Exactly. Now that you've agreed to divide, you have a right to privacy. So what are we really talking about, in a sense? Mechitza and its ambiguity, that we don't know what mechitza means, and we didn't. Because if it means the wall itself, then you don't have a right to privacy because you need to negotiate privacy with your co-owner. But if mechitza is just, we've decided to uncouple, then it seems that you do have a right to privacy implied in the Mishnah, because it seems that then you can coerce them into making sure that they can't see you anymore. Thus, hezek re'iyah shmei hezek. So we have two perspectives here, and they're tied to two different definitions of mechitza. All right, so let's make sure we can read it back into it, because that's what the Gemara is. The Gemara is a radical act of rereading. So the Mishnah says, two partners who wanted to make a mechitza in the courtyard build a wall in the middle. Read it like it's that you don't have a right to privacy. Someone try to do that. That you don't have a right to privacy. Sorry, let's do the one in which you do have it, because maybe that one actually is a little bit fresher in our mind. So read it like you do have a right to privacy.
Can I see if I understand the two scenarios?
Yeah, please.
So in this scenario, the first one,
yeah,
it's like they both own 100% of the property.
Okay, good. Well, yes,
is that right?
They both start that way.
And then in the second scenario, they each own 50% of the property.
Right. They went in Dutch on the thing and decided then to split it 50-50.
In both scenarios or just in the second one?
So in the first scenario of reading this, it seems that what they have agreed to do was build a wall. Together. So they never agreed to divide per se. Well, they did agree to divide, but only insofar as they agreed to build a wall.
Well, that's sort of why I'm sort of parsing if there's a distinction, because like if, I own the house with someone else and we decide to build a wall, then we decide together. But if we split the property 50-50, you're not physically splitting the property, you're splitting the ownership of it, right?
Precisely. Very good. Yes.
You're dividing the monetary value of the property.
Very nice. Yes.
Anyway.
Monetary, and it seems like that's mapping to the space of it, but yeah.
Okay. Because this is actually two separate units sharing the similar property, not one unit.
That's a way of putting it. I think, okay, so I want to, so what the rabbis are doing is that they're trying to read this, right? So I'm going to read it like you don't have a right to privacy. Two co-owners of this courtyard who wanted to make a mechitza, but that means some kind of physical division in the property, build the wall in the middle. So in that case, the only way to get privacy is if you both agree to it. And thus you don't have a right to it, right? Because you have to agree to it. Anything you need to negotiate, you don't have a right to. But if we read it like this, two co-owners of the courtyard who wanted to make a division, i.e. to divide the property, can force each other to build a wall in the middle. And in that reading, you do have a right to privacy because mechitza isn't tied to the wall. The wall is the consequence of the mechitza. Whereas in the first reading, the wall and the mechitza are one. Right? In the first reading, in which hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek, right? Vision damage, i.e. prying into people's business, is not something you can make sure that doesn't happen to you. In other words, you need to live with the fact that you co-own something with somebody, and tough noogies if they don't want to build a wall. But in the other reading, once you do decide to divide the property conceptually, right now each of you are owning 50% of it. In that case, now that you're neighbors effectively, you can make sure that you're not looking in on each other. So what we're talking about is two different ways of sharing. One way of sharing is that the both of you own 100%, or the both of you have rights to 100%. But once you decide to, in a sense, have like a less radical communist kind of style, right? Now you're like roommates. Now the question is like, what do you do with the common space? That's the classic roommate question, right? Like, okay, I have and bad roommates are like, I have the common space on like Mondays and Wednesdays, you have the common space on Tuesdays, Thursdays, we alternate weekends, right? That's like when you know something's gone wrong. And that's like something's happened here, right? You've decided like, you know what, I can't live with this guy anymore. I need to like split up. We need to get divorced, courtyard wise. I'm no longer a co-owner with you. I'm sorry, I tried. But because of that, then once you both agree to like uncouple, now you can say, great, and now that we're not sharing this anymore, I can make sure that you don't get into my business. But that's only as if we see the Mishnah as saying that like what they're agreeing to is splitting, not what they're agreeing to is the wall. So again, it's up in the air. These are both like, it's like Schrodinger's Mishnah. We don't know which one's right yet, and neither do the rabbis, because they're gonna. Do you think that this is the end? Oh no! This is going to occupy a fair amount of their discussion because they're going to keep on trying to figure out is how much of a right do you have from somebody who is next to you to say don't look at me, right? That's the question. Can you tell some? And so far we've seen if you have a full robust co-ownership of your property with somebody else, you can't say butt out. Like you were getting into that. You have conceded some of your privacy. And that's what happens if you share a space with somebody. But if you set the wheels in motion, says the second scenario, or the second way of reading the Mishnah, in which you decide that, you know what, actually privacy is important to me, right? Like I actually do want a little bit of separation from you. Then you can make sure that that's taken the rest of the way home, and you can coerce them or compel them, take them to court and say, give me 50% so I can make sure to build this wall. Okay. Questions, comments, insights? Yeah.
So there are conceptual and physical mechitzas. Are there conceptual and more official or more objective ways of making agreements?
That is a good question. Like in a sense, like if you were
like in this case, like is there a formal way of making this agreement, or can it just be a casual like, oh, I think maybe we should split this, or do they actually have to go through a process?
Right.
Something that can be verified, so that if they go to the court saying, we decided that we were going to split this space, is there a way of proving that or not?
Right. So in nowadays, or even as, like what do we have now to make sure that those kinds of misunderstandings are no longer?
We have contracts and.
Very good. So when contracts became huge was when in the early Middle Ages, when someone's signature was starting to be seen as a stand-in for their physical guarantee, for like their personal guarantee. And once there was a division, the devising of this thing, of a seal, right? You had like a personalized seal that you would use to seal a document. It was a way of authorizing it. It's like the same way that we have now. What's it called? What's called the people with the stamps? Notary publics. Notaries public. It's like attorneys at law. Notaries public, right, are people who make sure that your signature isn't forged. So now your signature stands in for who you are. And that's what the seal was. So, but we see, especially in the Middle Ages commentaries, like the Tosafot, everything's a contract to them because that's the way that you make sure that there's no kind of misunderstanding or ambiguity in these types of, in these kinds of agreements or disagreements. But is that necessarily the case in the Talmud? Well, the question is, how common were contracts, right? So we know that some contracts were common, right? Marriage contracts, divorce contracts. But when it comes to property, yes, a shtar is a contract is a possibility, but it wasn't always the case, right? And like we have this a lot of the time, unfortunately, right? Like if someone, chas v'shalom, someone dies, right? What are people scrambling around trying to find?
The will.
Right, treasure. No, sorry, will. The will, right? You need a contract to make sure you have an explicit understanding what to do with the estate. But what if they can't find the will? Right? Or even around the will, there's so much anxiety, right? It's like, oh, is this the most recent version of the will? Right? Like, how do I know they were like, were they non-compos mentis? Like, I don't know if they were in their right mind when they signed this will. Right? There's a lot of anxiety about the fact that like the person is gone and now I need to settle their affairs. And rightly so, because that's the question, right? Are we making sure that we're honoring their true request? So, Max, you're quite right in saying like, yeah, like a contract would firm up these ambiguities, but it's not always the case in the real world that you have a contract. Right? Sometimes like, like let's say you make a handshake deal. Does that count? Does that stand up in court? Right? Or let's say you have like like you make a contract on a napkin. Like these are things that still happen nowadays. Like there's all these kinds of like contested claims about ownership. So like again, Talmud, real world stuff. Like this is like the real world's a messy place. We have to figure out how to deal with it. Okay. Good to move further? You ready to get even more complicated? Yeah? Okay. So, if we take that reading right, that's saying that when we say mechitza, what we really mean is just a conceptual division, right? Not the actual physical thing. And the physical thing is a right that you now have, right? Once you agree to divide, you have a right to say, great, now let's build a wall. Right, so if we agree with that reading, then shouldn't the Mishnah have been more explicit? Maybe in a sense, this was the question that Max was intuiting. If we were saying that mechitza means just division, then why didn't it say if they wanted to divide? Not if they wanted to make a division, right? The phrase they wanted to make a division, does that sound like the division is something physical or not? This is getting like a little linguistic, but do we see the point?
Where it says la'asot mechitza,
Yes.
sounds something physical, but when it's a shiratzu lachzot, it just means they want it in half. So
exactly, you got it exactly right. That's right. So if the Mishnah was trying
speaking out of both sides.
Very nice. Very cute. I think you got it exactly right. Right? That like if the Mishnah was real, what's this objecting to? Again, like now we're getting into real Gemara stuff, right? This is real Gemara stuff. The claim is this. Okay, let's get it from first principles. If you want to say that when we're referring to mechitza, we're being as abstract and conceptual as possible, in English, how would you have communicated that? Just like give me a line in English to say that.
They can make a division or agree upon a division.
You just contradicted yourself.
Did I? No, no, if they're
okay,
not
I'll redo it. Which of these sound more abstract? If they want to make a division, or I could put it this way, if they wanted to divide, which one's more abstract?
If they want to divide.
Good, and that's exactly what the Mishnah is saying. The Mishnah is saying, listen, if you're trying to tell me mechitza doesn't mean something physical, then why does it say let's make it? Making sure sounds physical to me, right? Like the TV show Making It, right? Like it's like this craft show with Amy Poehler and Nick Offerman. Is that what it's called? Making It, right? Mom, what's it called?
I think so.
Yeah, it's called Making It. Making. Asiya. It's like you're doing a thing. So mechitza means a thing. So if you're trying to tell me mechitza is not a thing, then you should have said if they wanted to just, divide. That's way more clear. So what's the Gemara willing to do? The Gemara is willing to say, hey, Mishnah, like you got to be exact here, and I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. So thus, the fact that it says make a mechitza, it has to mean something physical. It needs to mean a guda. It needs to mean a physical barrier. Because if it didn't mean a physical barrier, it wouldn't have said make a noun. It would have said verb. Verbs are way more abstract than nouns, right? Okay, so that's like, we see the way in which these saboraic, conceptual, linguistic sugyas are focused on language and focused on ideas, right? It's very kind of reasoning based. But let's now, okay, so like, who thinks that they can intuit the second argument, right? Because this is just half of it. Who's going to try to use the rest of the Mishnah to push back? Except it says, build the wall in the Mishnah. Bonina to kotel, it says, right? Bonino to mebayale. If you're trying to tell me that mechitza means a thing, why did it specify wall explicitly afterwards? In other words, because it says build the wall after you say la'asot mechitza, it sure seems like those are different things. Because if you're saying they're the same thing, then why didn't it just say build it? The fact that it had to specify what it is that you're building means that mechitza has to be something else. And thus, that's an argument for the fact that mechitza has to mean something abstract. This is like heady. This is very heady. I want to make sure we get the point. We get what it's trying to do. The overarching idea here is that we as readers have a right to a clear Mishnah, and the Mishnah is a good enough text that it's going to be clear. So we can take all of its word choices, its diction, seriously. So the fact that it uses the word la'asot, to make, to build, a noun, the mechitza, seems to imply that the mechitza is something physical. It's a physical barrier. Because if it was just abstract, it should have just said to divide. Thus, mechitza seems to be something physical. It's a guda. But then the pushback to that is, okay, if you're saying the mechitza is something physical, then why right afterwards does the Mishnah says they build a wall? Why didn't they just say they build it, if it is referring to something we've already specified? And thus, mechitza has to be something other than a physical barrier. It needs to be something, just an agreement. It needs to just be a conceptual division of the property. And then we come to Lauren, because it says, fine, if we're going to say oto, then it was just a masifas ba'alma. We would have thought that it would have just been a thing. Just stakes in the ground. So that's the Scotch tape, right? The stakes in the ground is like a fence, but it's like a chain link fence. It's not a wall. It's not something that keeps you from looking in. It's just like a division. Kamash Malan, kotel. And that's why the Mishnah had to specify the word kotel. So in other words, that's a way of pushing back and saying, no, no, no. Mechitza does mean something physical, but I wouldn't have known that what the physical thing was a wall unless the Mishnah specified a wall. Masking tape. Yes. What kind of tape was I saying? Did I say Scotch?
Over and over.
Whatever, it's tape. Scotch tape's even less of a thing than masking tape is. It's translucent. Okay. So this is the real Gemara cup stuff. This is like the real tricky, heady stuff. Because it's being very punctilious, right? It's being very exacting about the language. This last one has like a little bit of a double step here, because it says, okay, building the wall, it should have just said building it. And then there's already now a pushback and saying, no, it had to specify the wall. Because if it didn't say the wall, then it seems like all you would have to agree to was just to put something, not serious, just stakes in the ground, just like a fence. And thus it had to specify a wall. Okay, so then what's the implied conclusion regarding privacy? Where are we on the pro-privacy or anti-privacy side? And a way to tie those two, remember, is an argument about the definition of mechitza. If you think mechitza means the thing itself, then that's something you need to agree to, and thus you don't have a right to it. But if you think mechitza means the concept of dividing, then you do have a right to compel somebody secondarily to build the thing. So who won this? Like, who won this? That mechitza is a thing or mechitza is not a thing?
In this particular section,
Yeah,
it,
this
it's
debate, this little mini debate.
I think it's a thing because of the whole, otherwise it would just be stakes in the ground thing.
Yes, exactly. Good. It is a thing. We do land on it being a thing. In other words, the first way of reading the Mishnah, in which case the mechitza is a thing. And because of that, then you don't have a right for privacy. You don't have a right to split off from your neighbor. You can agree to split off. And once you do agree to split off, once you do agree to build something, you can, it seems like, then interestingly, and now it seems like it's a little more complex. Because it seems that once you agree to build something in the middle, it seems like what you can force them to agree to is a wall. Right? Once you agree to build something, then you can actually say, you know what, but if we're going to build something, we should build something for real, not just like make it something flimsy like stakes in the ground. So it seems like now in some way it's kind of like infected. Right? Now it seems like even the approach that says you don't have a right to privacy from your co-owner, but once you agree, it's like the positions have kind of come closer together. Once you agree to build something, now you can say, fine, but we need to build something real. We need to build something substantive, because otherwise it's not really going to do its job. And now we get to our first rabbis. Interestingly, now we have our first actually appearance of like real rabbis. Because like until here, it was just the anonymous editorial voice, the saboraim, or these philosophy rabbis, these rabbis who are just obsessed with being of your language. And here we're going to end. So, Susie's quite right that the conclusion it comes to is that hezek re'iyah lashmei hezek, right? That you don't have a right to privacy because you need to come to that agreement with somebody. And then we have our first thing about the garden, right? But if you can do it in a garden, then it seems like you can do it because you can compel someone to put up a garden. They don't take that analogy totally with it. They don't follow it all the way. I'm going to move forward a little bit, skip this a little bit. Because here what we have is the final parts of it, but I want to make sure we get it. So you see this phrase keep on popping up: tashma, tashma, tashma. So I want to make sure we're building a technical vocabulary of the Talmud. Tashma means come and hear. Interestingly, it correlates with the Zohar, which has the phrase tachaze, come and see, and that's maybe like an interesting division. Like the Gemara is about discussion, and it's about debate, it's about hearing, it's about listening, it's about learning. And the Zohar, it's a mystical text, it's about seeing, right? It's having this like immediate experience of mystical experience. You're using your eyes. It's the difference between listening and looking. But Tashma means that they're citing a rabbinic statement. So they're sourcing themselves in some kind of rabbinic teaching. So I want to look at one of these just to see how they keep on just perpetuating this debate. So let's end with this last one. So it says, come in here, as Rav Nachman said that Shmuel said. So they're citing a Amoraic statement, two Amoraic rabbis from the generation of the Gemara. If you have a roof that abuts a neighbor's courtyard, make a fence 4 cubits tall. Actually, no, I don't want to do that one. I want to do the one about the... here it is. Okay. Come in here. If one wants to build a wall in a courtyard and there are neighbors nearby, it needs to be distanced 4 cubits, above, below, or facing. Why? Right? So what's the situation? It seems that you are the sole owner of a courtyard now, but you have neighbors. And in what way, actually, do your neighbors keep you from having, let's say, full rights over it? What are you not allowed to do? You with me?
Are you talking about what the neighbor can't do or what you
No.
can't do?
Okay, you own a courtyard, and it's your courtyard. But the courtyard is near other people's houses. What can't you do?
What can't you do? I thought you can build something to prevent them
Yes, you
from
can build
looking in.
something on your property. This is like what the case that Susie was talking about before. But what can't you do? You are allowed to build on your property. That is true. But what's the
Oh,
limit?
you can't compel them to build or
True.
to
Good.
pay
You
for
can't
it.
force them to build, and you can't do that. It's your property, right? You're responsible. But what can't you do?
You can't put the wall like right up next to the window. There has to be some space.
Good. If there are windows of the neighboring houses, you are not allowed to have the wall be 4 cubits taller than the window, 4 cubits shorter than the window, or 4 cubits away from the window. It needs to be at least 4 cubits from each of those. Why? Here we're getting to maybe like our most intuitive, like we had to get all the way to the bottom of the sugya to get to the most intuitive example. Why? It's a window, remember. And what was like our intuitive issue about the right to privacy? What can't you do?
Look into other people's.
Yes, you can. Right. Okay. Good job, Talmud. You can't be a peeping Tom. Good job, Talmud. That is correct. You're not allowed to do that, right? But how do we make sure that you do that? You make sure that that you don't have a situation in which you have abused your property rights to gain advantage over somebody else. You cannot build the wall and say, like, it's my property. I can do what I want. Its property rights are sacred. I mean, they are. You do have rights in your property. You do have a right to build a wall, but not in a way that makes someone else's life insecure. You're not allowed to build a wall in such a way that you could stand on top of it and look into their stuff, like look into their house. You can't build a wall such that if you stand, if you climb it, that you can see into them, right? Those are the 4 cubits above and below. If it's like taller than 4 cubits, then it seems like the angle's not going to be good anymore. And if it's lower than 4 cubits, again, you won't be able to like look in because a normal person is not 4 cubits tall. That's like 10 feet tall, right? That's pretty darn tall. So like, it seemed like you're, let's say, 6 feet tall, and you still have another 4 feet to go until you could see their window. So good, that's keeping you from looking in. And then lastly, actually, you're not allowed to have it right up against the wall. Why? Wait, don't look at the text. Why? Think about living in a city.
You would completely block their view. They would be almost like suffocated. It would be right against their wall. They'd have no light, no air coming through.
You got it exactly right, right? It's going to block them, right? So it's interestingly what they have a right to is a certain modicum of quality of life. And you're not allowed to do 2 things. One is you're not allowed to take away their natural light, and you're not allowed to create a situation in which you could peer in on them, right? You could spy on them, you could be a peeping Tom, whatever it is. You cannot violate their right to privacy. So it seems like from this that you do have a right to privacy in the sense that if someone builds a wall 4 cubits away from my building or less than, I can sue them and say, take down that gosh darn wall because you are violating my right to privacy. And now, interestingly, we've divided property from privacy. Before we were saying, oh, the end of my property is the extent of my right to privacy. I can keep people out of my stuff. But here we see that what are the rabbis really looking into? It's not about what I have rights to myself as an individual and what I own, but rather it's what rights do I have as somebody living next to others? What rights do I have as somebody negotiating always what it means to share space with other people? What kind of rights do I have how do I make claims for my own dignity in a society in which I am constantly negotiating what that entails, right? What the limits of my rights are. I think the Talmud is getting something the reason this is such a complex discussion is because it's a complex question. How much do I have a right to make a claim on somebody else? How much do I have a right to separate myself out from others? How much do I have a right to protect myself? Well, it seems like the rabbis do agree. You have an absolute right to protect yourself, right? You can make a claim onto someone else's property. You can force them to not use their full property rights because it impinges on your well-being. That's actually a pretty strong claim. Right, because now, at least I think in most places, right, you have a right to build up to the line of your property. I mean, you don't have a right to spy in on someone else's thing. I'm sure there are regulations around that. But the Talmud here is saying you actually don't have a right to exercise full property rights if it impinges on someone else's well-being. Okay, that's interesting. You have elsewhere in the Sugya, it says actually you do have a right to privacy when it comes to protecting yourself from the public eye, right? Like the public doesn't get to spy in on you. That makes sense. But what don't you have a right to privacy for? if you've come into an agreement with somebody else, you don't have a right to on the spot change that agreement. And that seems to be the sticking point for why the rabbis before were saying, oh, hezek re'iyah lav shmei hezek, right? You don't have an absolute right to privacy. You don't have a right to, if you are in a jointly owned situation, a partnership, you don't have a right to get divorced all of a sudden. You don't have a right to kick them out because you went into an agreement together. You need to negotiate what that means.
I'd like
So
to add,
the bottom, one second, Eric. So the bottom line, interestingly, is that the Talmud always recognizes that you are amidst other people, and it's trying to, in a very nuanced and complex way, help us see what the lines are in terms of like what license we have, what liberty we have to flex and to exercise those rights. But it's always going to be hedged. There's the hedge that you're talking about before, the verb hedge. It's always going to be hedged on by other people's rights as well. The privacy is not something absolute. It's always something that's within a social context.
I was going to add that my
Yeah.
house has at least 4 or 5 violations where outside a window I can look directly into a neighbor's window. But the reason that's allowed is because that was those windows and things were built long before the present bylaw came into effect, which because my house was built in 1898, and the one next door. So when you say that, I noticed that every place, I've had to put up, what do you call it, non-see-through film, so I don't look directly into the neighbors. And in fact, in one of them, it's so severe that if they leave their door open, I look right into their washroom.
Oh no! Right.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I think you're noting something really quite important, which is like what happens when the world changes under your feet, right? And like then actually, do these like new laws get grandfathered in? Do they have a right to like kind of make you like could people make a real financial claim on you and say, listen, like I'm sorry, now that the law is what it is, I have certain rights. I think like these are really tough questions. I think usually people are like protected in those kinds of ways because we recognize the extent to which like it's unfair to like change the name of the game on people. But I think what makes this Talmudic discussion so powerful, which gets continued on in the halacha, is that it recognizes all of these different factors. It doesn't just say like, again, this is what's powerful about Talmud. It's not just about like major principles, right? Oh, like Judaism, it doesn't, you cannot say about the Talmud, Judaism believes. That's my least favorite phrase in the entire world. Judaism doesn't believe anything. Judaism contains, right? The Talmud is a manifold, complex, and nuanced discussion that tries to get at the truth, but the truth isn't boiling something down to the essence. The truth is trying to look at every single facet of what we're trying to analyze. Try to really have the most mature and worked out version of what that means. And to even like twist yourself into pretzels to try to get at every single way that you could imagine thinking about this thing. It's unrealistic, but intentionally so, because who knows what life has to throw at us, right? We have to imagine every single contingency so that we can be as well prepared as we can to respond wisely and I think thoughtfully to the world as it presents itself.
These laws are so needed in modern day Israel. I mean, I lived in Zichron for a while, which was a lovely little, I don't know if you've been there. Well, it used to be a kfar. I mean, it was tiny with little houses and everything. And all of a sudden now, like very wealthy people are moving in, building monster homes. And you can actually wind up with a home that's built smack against your window or against your balcony and like a wall there. There's nothing you can do about it. So, yeah, it's nothing to have people throw their garbage into your yard, etc., etc. They don't make for good neighbors. but we they really need those laws there.
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting, actually, when I was in university, we studied the second chapter of Maseches Bava Batra, which has to do actually with other kinds of ways in which you have like abutting property and what that means. But my professor Eliezer Diamond saw that as a really interesting precedent for environmental regulation. The ways in which we have you have leakage or seepage or things like that. But the way that these lines that we draw are in some ways real, they're legal, but they're not real. right? They're agreements that we come to. But the real world, right? There's no provincial boundaries between Ontario and Quebec. That's something that we made up. It's something we've agreed to, and it's useful, but it's also not real, right? Like we know, like environmentally speaking, like or like Lo Aleinu and Rahman al Islam, but like thinking about COVID, right? COVID doesn't respect international boundaries, right? Like all of the policing of the borders and like transportation and things like that. Yes, we can keep people from crossing them, but like natural forces don't agree to political lines. So we see the ways in which like our impact on the world extends beyond our ownership of it, or the way that we own things, right? Like we our presence in this world reverberates and resonates, like lines extending outward like a Doppler effect. Okay.
I think it gets interesting when you talk about social media, though, and the privacy with regards to that.
Yeah.
Which would, I think oddly it could apply in some.
Oh, very much, very much. Like we've been talking about like physical concrete property and rights thereof, but like, the way in which some people now even say like the right to privacy is in the past, right? We like that doesn't exist anymore. Which is like a very radical idea, but like some very mainstream people believe that, and now just with like information is free, that privacy is very to ensure privacy is too hard, and it's not it's just impossible to do nowadays with us publicizing everything about ourselves in the way in which major corporations then own it. Like
on the other hand, having worked in hospital, the laws really, really tightened up in the early 2000s to the point where it wasn't so clear that we could transfer information on a patient's medication from a pharmacy to the hospital pharmacy. So it had to be, turned out we could, but it was difficult. And there's federal legislation and there's provincial legislation. And hospital records now, it's you have to go through a whole process just to get your own chart. But people, at least don't have to be worried that their medical information can go through. And it's the same thing with being electronic. Somebody found there was a famous patient who was at Sinai, and some people were like, they got their rights taken away, and the hospital had to really chew them out for going into this person's record when they had no right to. They were just being curious about the famous person. So we do have some privacy rights.
Yes, within specific technical situations, those, like freedom of information and things like, like governmental information is still enshrined in privacy. Spies, right, have a right to keep things private for a long time.
And medical, which is very important.
But no, but like, but you're saying like it's only in specific technical situations now that privacy seems to be enshrined versus it being the default. So like this notion is like hezek re'iyah shmei hezek or not, right? Is privacy, like vision damage, being sure people don't look at your stuff, is that something that we can totally assume? Like even back in the Gemara, it recognizes that like this is something that is contested at the very least, right? And it's subject to complexity. It is late. Yeah, Eric, I'm gonna let you say one more comment, and then I'm gonna wrap us up. Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to say, to show how fast things change, the conversations between a doctor and pharmacy had to be by fax, and still is.
Not true. Not true.
Yes, it does.
No. You can call the doctor still. It's easier by fax.
Okay, you can call the doctor, but the preferred method is fax, because that's the only thing that sent a signature. And in those days, and at that time, the idea of an electronic signature was not accepted.
The reason actually is because it's easier and faster, and the doctor gets so many repeats. Now, I'm a pharmacist, I know.
I know, but I'm telling you what the original reason was behind it.
Never mind.
I'm gonna intervene.
Have a nice
I'm gonna intervene, although
Good
I'm
evening.
also gonna.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, take care. Lauren, thank you for sharing your expertise. I believe you.
Gewalt.
So I think one thing, I'm glad this is recorded for posterity. One thing I want to say is that the fact about electronic signatures and the like, and like looking at COVID, God save us, is a really interesting example of the way that like suddenly it seemed that there was sudden comfort with telehealth, right? With doing doctor's appointments on the phone, facilitating much more through the internet. But that means that every time that we agree towards mediated forms of communication, right? Zoom, for God's sake, right? We're agreeing to let people look at us, right? We're agreeing to let people look at the way that we make agreements, that we make we make discussions with each other, we have interactions with each other. So the more the world becomes mediated, the more that we do cede in some way our rights to property for the sake of convenience, or even in the case of like telehealth or something like that, for the sake of our public health, right? We make certain concessions. It's a really complex topic, and but seeing the way in which this is like, I think, a fundamental human anxiety. And I don't mean anxiety in a pathological sense, but I mean a fundamental human concern, and something that we rightly shouldn't sit so easy with all the time, which is that like, should we, like, our credulity, should we take something at face value? Or like, how much can we really deem something authenticated or authorized? And once things become, the first social media was paper, right? Like, okay, yeah, contract makes everything clear, right? Yeah, except that, like, I don't know about you, but I mean, like, deep fakes, right? Now we have videos that can look like something's real, that someone, like, it sure looks like Josh is saying something. Fooled you all. This has all been a pre-recorded video. You've been interacting with a robot. Sorry, guys. I've been anticipating everything you were going to say. This is all fake. But that's like an actual feasible thing now, right? Like all of these things are feasible, and we've lost a sense in which there's like a concrete basis of reality. So when we're saying like the right to privacy, what we're really asking about is like, how much do I have the right towards a concrete and stable social situation in which my lines are divided from yours, and there's a clear sense of like what we owe to each other. But the Gemara, I think, quite rightly notes that it's always negotiated, and it's been negotiated from the outset. You're always coming to agreement in some way with somebody else that sets the terms for what it means to abut each other, to be next to each other. There's a term that Judith Butler draws from Hannah Arendt that I'm forgetting. I think it's cohabitant. I believe that's the term that she prefers. Thinking about geopolitical things, right? Contested territories. But she uses the term of someone who is cohabitating with you, someone who lives with you. And it's that living with you that is the basis of a lot of these ethics. And I think we even see that as, in one of the most beautiful verses of the whole Torah, right? The one that Rabbi Akiva says is the key to the whole Torah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, but to love your neighbor. And the fact that it's a commandment means that's not always assumed you're going to do it. So, talking about good fences and good neighbors, I think the Gemara is giving us a lot of conceptual tools to help us figure out what does it mean for us to be able to live ethically next to each other in a way that respects each other. It's grounded in ensuring and honoring each member's dignity. So it's something that is still a relevant question today, and something that I was so excited to get to explore with you. As you can tell, there's always more to say. There's always more to get into. But this is a real classic sugya, and it's like a real heady one. So shkoyach to all of you. Please God, see you again soon. We'll have Torah class, Parsha chat Thursday at 7. And then Shabbos, Baruch Hashem, and then Havdalah, probably 6:05. Check the email for the specific time. All of it's the same link. But also keep your eyes peeled. We're going to be having a special Tu B'Shvat program. We're actually going to be doing it second year in a row as a joint program with Sha'arei Shamayim. We'll be doing.
Oh.
We'll be guests at they're doing a Tu B'Shvat Tish Wednesday night as part of the Beit Midrash Zichron, the Beit Midrash program there, and then we are hosting them, virtually speaking, at our second annual Tu B'Shvat Seder. And I'm very excited to have been collaborating with Rabbi Sammy Bergman, who's a really, really sweet guy at Sha'arei Shamayim and at the Beit Midrash. So we'll be doing that. So we'll be virtually hosting a Tu B'Shvat Seder Thursday night, which is nice because Thursday night we have like a nice momentum going. So that'll be 7 o'clock Thursday night, the last Thursday in January. Hope to see you there. There will be an email going out Sunday, Blinetter, in which you'll have the instruction of what you need to get, like wines and fruits and things like that. But it'll all be written out. And as always, you can always reach out to me for more clarification. And hopefully see you again next Tuesday for the third class, in which we'll be looking at another juicy sugya. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night.